What are your experiences with discrimination?
The discrimination I've experienced has been primarily because of my queer status. Um, I can recall going to the movies one time with Drew, and we were sharing a popcorn together and sitting next to each other in the movie theater. And I could feel the stares from this guy a couple rows over, and they were angry, and I could feel his eyes burning into the side of my head. And it was really uncomfortable. And he ended up getting up at some point during the movie, and shortly thereafter, I saw a police officer appear in the aisle and was walking up and down the aisle and kept staring at us. And needless to say, this is extremely uncomfortable. And it was towards the end of the movie, and when we were getting up to leave, this police officer followed us all the way to our car. So that was probably the most blatant experience I had, other than the fact that queer people often cannot do the things that straight people take for granted. You can hold hands with your boyfriend and walk down any street of any town, anywhere in America, and not think twice about it, and just enjoy being together and having a good time. And anytime that I reach out to hold my husband's hand, I have to think twice about who's around, how do I anticipate the culture and politics of the people in that area. Will we be assaulted? Will we be verbally attacked? And all of those things, to some degree, have happened just by expression of affection that heterosexual people can take for granted. And that still exists today. And I think there's an important message in that about people who live the norm, people who live as a member of the majority, have a lot of trouble seeing that there's bigotry or racism or homophobia because they don't experience it. And comments from people such as, "I don't care what people do, just don't put it in my face." Just the expression of that comment is inherently homophobic, but people have trouble recognizing that that's the case. I remember members of my own family several years back who said that they were all for queer and gay people having relationships, but marriage was too much. They should just have civil unions. And these were people close to me, and having no comprehension of how that sounded, and nor any understanding that they were part of the problem. Now, as a white male, I do not experience a lot of the discrimination that my Native American Mexican husband does, where he's been stopped because of driving while brown, because I can not necessarily be perceived as queer. People with different skin tone can't hide that. And he's been followed around in stores and had people eyeing him as he's browsing through stores where I would never experience that. There was one episode in his life where when he lived in California, and he had a very nice place on the mountainside, the cliff sides of Laguna, I wish we still had that place. He had recently purchased the place and was having some work done on it. And there was a work crew doing whatever they were doing with it. And when he walked in, the foreman of the work crew turned to him and said, don't use the front door, go through the back door. I'm sure the owners wouldn't like that. And Drew laughed it off and he said, well, I happen to know the owner and he's okay with it. So he was able to laugh that off. So those would be my personal and closest to home experiences with discrimination, other than obviously what I witness from friends, colleagues, and what goes on in the world on an everyday basis.
What are your experiences with activism?
I have participated in several marches, several protests. I remember traveling when I was a master's student at Columbia, traveling with a group of students to Washington, D.C., where the now very famous AIDS quilt had just been put together and was stretched out across the lawn of in front of the Washington Monument, and that was very meaningful. I've attended numerous local protests, protests in New York City, and all for various causes, for LGBT rights, for justice against discrimination of a racial sort, several feminist marches. My mother brought up a very good feminist in me. I've tried to in you and your sister. My mother was a trailblazer in the Lutheran Church, in that she was one of the first women ever to become ordained, as the Lutheran Church did not allow that. And I remember her coming home in tears with stories of how many obstacles she had to overcome, with experiences and stories as I got older, where she would tell me high-ranking bishops in the church had made sexual advances towards her, and where she was terrified to tell anyone because she was worried that that would derail her calling to become a minister. And I've been surrounded, fortunately, in my schooling and in my experiences with friends and acquaintances that have absolutely inspired me to try to do more than the humble things that I have done, although important things. So yeah, those are my experiences with protest.
As your daughter, how do you want me to understand the context of recent race events?
This is probably the most serious question that we are facing right now as a nation, and that I have been struggling to new realizations with even in the last couple weeks. There is a real sense of agitation and uneasiness going on in the white community, which I think is fantastic. In talking with friends and family members about what is going on and how they feel nervous and how they feel scared, I realized how powerful those emotions were in letting us know how wrong things have been. It's very difficult as people in power, generally white people, generally white straight people, but white people as a whole, even understanding what it means to hold the power that we do, because our society is structured to support and maintain our status. And that's hard to recognize. It's hard to see if you're not looking or curious to look what that has done to anyone who doesn't fit the power structure. We should be uncomfortable. We should be feeling senses of guilt and uneasiness, and the discussion needs to change. I'm going to say some things that I hope that my fellow colleagues and family members who are involved in law enforcement or have family members in law enforcement take from a place of love and take from a place of sincerity. We have been brainwashed to reduce these greater conversations of race into, oh, there's a couple bad apple protesters and there's a couple bad apple police officers, and that's really all this is. And leaving the discussion at that is so reductive, because that's not what we're talking about, and that's not what is going on, causing such ripples in our social fabric. Of course there's good people in any walk of life. Of course there's bad people in any walk of life. And if we were all starting from the same starting point, if we all had equal power and equal resources and equal access, we could limit the discussion while there's good and there's bad people. But there's not. We need to take a giant deep breath and look in the mirror and say, I am complicit in race discrimination. I am complicit in keeping people of color down. You don't have to be the person who put a knee on someone else's neck to be complicit in racism. What we do on a daily basis is comprehensively rooted in daily racism. And yes, that means police officers. People in power. I am a person in power. I am a white person. I have a high responsibility job, and my actions or inactions speak volumes in the community in which I work. Politicians hold enormous power, and their actions or inactions speak volumes about how they are contributing to the status quo of discrimination and race relations. And yes, police officers, particularly because of the role they have and the power that they have in society, must take responsibility and look in the mirror. Of course, the vast majority of police officers do not assault people of color. I believe that. And I would go as far to say as the vast majority of police officers would not consider themselves participatory in racism. But we all do, including police officers. And the police officer who is silent when his or her colleagues are making racial jokes in the break room is complicit. The police officer who is aware that their colleagues or have witnessed their colleagues using excessive force where it felt uncomfortable, where it felt unnecessary and didn't do anything or report it, are complicit. No one calls themselves a racist. No one looks in the mirror and says, you know what, I'm a racist. We have to start doing that. We have to start taking that deep breath and saying, my lack of action in these areas made me complicit. There there are powerful forces at work that keep power intact. Police officers enjoy a level of protection in the law that makes it difficult to prosecute. They enjoy a level of social protection in that questioning a police officer, questioning a person in uniform, questioning a member of the military means you are anti-American, means you are unpatriotic, so the discussion can't even get off the ground. It is a fact, a cold hard fact, that statistically more people of color experience harsher prison terms, harsher sentences, are arrested at a higher rate, experience police brutality at a higher rate. People who have walking in the park in the most recent episode and have someone call the police on them. And this happens at a rampant pace, statistically, factually true, more than white folks. But we don't talk about that. We're not allowed to talk about that. We're not allowed to question the power structure that's in place. We're not allowed to collect data on the number of times a police officer has engaged in excessive force, to know how they've been reprimanded. This is a country that federally will not spend dollars to study gun violence. There's certain areas that are protected, that institutionally protected. And so when we boil down what is going on right now to good apples and bad apples, it misses the whole point that there is intrinsic inequality that started from slavery and what happened to slavery and people's access to wealth, access to loans, access to education, access to jobs. It hasn't been equal, it still isn't equal, but yet we treat as though everyone's working hard and everyone's on the same playing field, and there are just simply people who succeed and people who don't, and there are good actors and there are bad actors. But we don't take ownership of the fact that the people we vote for, the laws that we allow them to enact, the shoulders that we turn away from opportunity to question or to disrupt these types of power structures means we are complicit. We are complicit in contributing to the racism, and not being able to talk about it without being blasted as some sort of rebel or some sort of anti-patriot just perpetuates this. We have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and say we are contributing to this. And if we feel we're not contributing to this, if we feel that it's someone else's problem and it's just a matter of other people getting better and other people behaving better, then we probably are a racist. The very least we can do is to recognize how we've contributed and to work towards it. And that also means taking the responsibility to learn, taking the responsibility to be informed, taking the responsibility to listen to more than one news source, taking the responsibility to hear different points of view and be able to formulate an analysis. Because you can pick your news sources nowadays like you pick your favorite flavor of ice cream, and we're completely unchallenged. As a matter of fact, even the discussion in this country nowadays of people who do obtain higher levels of intellectualism or education are deemed un-American, are deemed elite, are deemed out of touch, and this just perpetuates the status quo of maintaining the power structure. And I know that I would tell you and your sister and your friends to recognize that you are complicit in racism. I am complicit in racism. The police officers are complicit in racism. The people that we vote for are complicit in racism. And until we can admit this very fact, that this is not an equal society, that it's not somewhere where everybody has the same chance. I saw a meme that was so powerful and so simple in that white people work hard. Of course white people work hard. And of course, white people have struggles. And of course, white people have faced challenges. But imagine how much more difficult those same challenges are when you are a person of color. And our failure of imagination to have empathy for that, to even recognize that, makes us all complicit racists. Let's own it. Let's address it. Let's let it inform how we treat each other, to stand up more when we are recognizing racism in all of our professions, to act, to be bold. And then we will see a society in which people don't have to resort to anguish, don't have to resort to angry protests, don't have to resort to measures that disrupt our society. Society is already disrupted. Let's equal the playing field.